This is Moby-Dick, considered today to be a great American classic, but for Herman Melville, it ruined his career. It so thoroughly destroyed his reputation that when he died at 72, people were shocked. But they weren't shocked that he died, they were shocked because they thought he'd been dead for decades.
I thought he already died.
And I know what you're thinking. So what? Lots of authors die in obscurity only to be discovered posthumously and become famous. But Melville was different. Melville had become a successful author. Had he died 40 years earlier, it would have been the loss of a literary icon and one of America's favorite authors. So what exactly happened that turned Melville from a successful author into a forgotten nobody? The answer is Moby-Dick. Moby-Dick isn't just Melville's masterpiece, it is a real contender for the greatest American novel ever. The book is narrated by Ishmael, a cabin boy, and it follows Captain Ahab, who leads the whaling ship Pequod. Ahab has lost his leg to a giant whale and seeks revenge, embarking on a quest to kill the notorious whale Moby-Dick. But to understand how Moby-Dick ruined Melville, we need to back up a little bit. Melville's first novel, Typee, was published when he was just 26 years old in 1846, and it was followed by Omoo, and both were hits. They were adventure novels, in the same vein as Robinson Crusoe, fun and easy to read. By 30, he had written 5 novels and cemented himself as one of America's most beloved adventure writers. And then he began work on Moby-Dick, and it began like all his other novels, except he met Nathaniel Hawthorne along the way. Hawthorne suggested that Moby-Dick could be turned into an allegory, which is precisely what Melville did. Moby-Dick went from a relatively straightforward adventure novel into a much more philosophical work. Melville was a bit obsessed with Hawthorne. The two shared a mutual respect and maybe something more.
Oh, gossip.
He even dedicated Moby-Dick to Hawthorne. When Moby-Dick was finally finished and released to the public, It flopped hard. Critics and fans had expected another fun adventure novel. What they got instead was a 135-chapter philosophy of life. Ahab breaks off into long speeches about life and the universe, along with long digressions about actual whaling. Readers just thought it was way too much. The whale scenes were vivid and exciting, but everything else was just dull and dreary. When it came out in Britain in 1851, simply titled The Whale, critics dismissed it as the ravings of a madman. Part of this wasn't Melville's fault at all, but it still affected book sales. So whose fault was it? The British publishers. Even though Melville was American, it was pretty common at that time to publish your book first in Britain. The problem was that Victorian-era publishers would remove anything that they thought might offend political and moral sensibilities. And they did this without consulting the author. As a result, they took out 35 passages, they moved opening extracts into an appendix that they created, and most importantly, they removed the epilogue. And spoiler alert, the epilogue is absolutely essential to the understanding of Moby-Dick. It is where you find out that Ishmael survives. If you don't have the epilogue, it looks like everyone dies, which makes no sense since Ishmael narrates the novel. British readers were justifiably upset because this novel had a dead narrator. One review called it so much trash. A London Spectator review said the book repels the reader instead of attracting him. When the book was printed in America, it had those missing pieces, so it made more sense, but the book's fate was already sealed. To make matters worse, American critic reviews at this time looked to the British for how to feel about things. A lot of times they just reprinted British reviews or took big portions of them rather than reading the book themselves. So the British experience with the novel became the American one too, and sales were terrible. The book was his worst book to date. Melville was in debt now because Moby-Dick had taken him 18 months to write instead of the 6 months that he had anticipated. He wrote to Hawthorne and said, "Dollars damn me. What I feel most moved to write, that is banned. It will not pay. Yet altogether, write any other way I cannot." So, Moby-Dick was a disaster. But it gets worse. Melville's next novel, Pierre, was published just 1 year later in 1852, and it was meant to mend both his image and his finances. It was a psychological romance, but the reviews were equally bad. The headline of one review was "Herman Melville Crazy," cementing his reputation as a raving lunatic. At 33, Melville was finished. He attempted one more book, going back to what gave him success in the first place, a straightforward adventure. He told the publisher, "There will be little reflective writing in this. Nothing weighty. It is adventure." But even that could not save his career. In 1863, he got a job as a customs inspector on the New York docks, which he did for the rest of his life, writing poetry and short stories only in his spare time. He slipped, plummeted, into obscurity. All of his novels were out of print by 1876. He became so obscure that if people remembered him at all, they thought he was long dead. He was so little known that when he did actually die of a heart attack in 1891, only one newspaper printed an obituary, 3 sentences, and they even misspelled Moby-Dick. It was only in 1919, what would have been his 100th birthday, that he was rediscovered. Raymond Weaver was asked to do a little write-up for the occasion. He realized that there wasn't much known about Melville, so he pieced together a biography, uncovering an unpublished novella, Billy Budd, in the process. And this began Melville's Revival. And what a revival it has been. In the 1920s, academics were compiling America's literary canon, and they discovered Moby-Dick. It had exactly what they were looking for: beautiful prose, unconventional ideas, symbolism, universal themes. It discussed things like social status, the destructive power of obsession, and good versus evil. By the 1930s, Melville had become king of American canon, and that reign really hasn't ended. Moby-Dick now has a place on most of the best books ever lists. It's been adapted countless times for stage and screen. It's permeated our culture with terms like white whale and Ahab quotes.
"From hell's heart I stab at thee."
Melville has now stamped his name on American culture for over 100 years. But I can't help but wish that he lived to see the day that Moby-Dick was finally appreciated. My name is Melanie. This is Drawn to Books. I'll catch you on the next one.